Kia ora tātou. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure as one of the organisers of the Weapons, Wounds and Warfare series, which is run by the University of Auckland's War and Context Research Hub, to host our second seminar event, this time a hybrid one. We have a small glitch in that we have lost one of our speakers in the ether of Zoom somewhere, so hopefully he will turn up in the course of the seminar. But in the meantime, it is my very great pleasure to introduce you all to Elzanne Bester, who is a recently graduated with her Masters in Conflict and Terrorism Studies here at Owananga Te Tamaki Makaurau. And she is going to speak to us today on her master's research, individual wounds, systemic rape and cultural genocide. So welcome, over to you.
Thank you. Kia ora, everyone who's able to attend online. Kia ora tātou to everyone who could make it in person. And yeah, so thank you for the introduction. Today I will be giving a seminar on the weaponization of sexual violence. This is just a word of warning. The content in this seminar may be a little bit graphic, so just for anyone, just so everyone is aware that yeah, this content may be disturbing for some people, but yeah, if it is, please don't listen. If you are okay with it, then yeah, so today I'm going to really be talking about sexual violence and namely its weaponization in this interdisciplinary workshop series entitled Weapons, Wounds and Warfare. Now the series did force me to really hone in on my research question and to really extract the ways in which I could tackle and look at weaponization and the weaponization of sexual violence, so that it fit within this framework. So the research question that I came up with is to what extent does the notion of weaponization perpetuate the systemic othering of victims of sexual violence? Now, while I have done some research in this area, this specific research topic is hopefully a potential research article, something that I hope to present with more certainty at a later stage. But this seminar is very much just a time and a chance for me to test out some of my ideas and to explore some of the underlying questions I've had about this phenomenon. So yeah, the aim of this research is to understand and deconstruct the frame of weaponization in the context of sexual violence and conflict, and as we'll later see, also not in conflict. Contexts which are deemed non-conflict zones. Cool. So to start off with, we're just going to, I'll talk you through some definitions. So generally, sexual violence is a subset of gender-based violence more broadly, and today I'll just be focusing specifically on sexual violence. Now, the WHO defines sexual violence as any sexual act, attempt to obtain a sexual act, or other act directed against the person's sexuality using coercion by any person regardless of their relationship to the victim in any setting. Now looking more specifically at conflict-related sexual violence, it refers to rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, enforced sterilization, enforced marriage, and any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity perpetuated against women, men, girls, and boys that is directly or indirectly linked to a conflict. Now, this definition was obtained in the recent 2021 Security Council resolution condemning sexual violence in conflict. So this was the most recent definition I could find from the UN. And we'll see a bit later in the presentation how some of those words can be a little problematic, and we'll explore that a bit in the discussion on weaponisation. So to kind of ground ourselves a little bit in the broader topic, I just wanted to highlight some kind of key debates that are really talked about when we refer to sexual violence and the weaponisation of sexual violence. So first, some see, well, yeah, there's kind of two schools of thought here on sexual violence and conflict, where some see sexual violence and conflict-related sexual violence as completely distinct and separate from one another. Another school of thought sees sexual violence and conflict as part of a continuum of gender-based violence, also affecting men and boys, which is often exacerbated during conflict, but present in peacetime and pre- and post-conflict settings. Cool. So some things we also know about sexual violence. So the WHO indicates that globally about 1 in 3 women, so 30% of women worldwide, have been subjected to non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. This figure is actually, yeah, completely not even accurate, and we can assume that the number is actually more prevalent. However, this is just really just due to the kind of the tip of the iceberg phenomenon, where we know the prevalence is high, but due to just kind of gender inequalities present in context, women don't come forward. But these estimates are good to really ground us in the assumption that sexual violence can and predominantly does happen to women and girls in conflict. As these estimates highlight the underlying intersectional vulnerabilities women experience due to systemic gender inequality and marginalizations. Generally speaking, women globally have fewer rights, less access to resources, and are therefore more susceptible to violence. We also know that younger women are more likely to experience sexual violence than older women. However, this again does come with a broad recognition that sexual violence does also affect men and boys to a greater extent than previously understood. And then, yeah, so a great article by Graham Shepherd, when looking at the lack of reporting on sexual violence with men and boys, they problematize the essentialist conceptualization of the female body as the object of sexual violence. They further criticize the politics of violence because it is framed around the victim's inherently femaleness, ignoring the larger gendered aspect of violence. Now, this presentation applies a similar lens in my investigation, interrogating why the body of a victim of sexual violence is inherently female and her victimness is seen as a given because she is female. The aim of this critical analysis is to demonstrate how frames of sexual violence strengthens the objectification of women and girls. And to do so, I will lend the term coined and developed by a pioneering feminist, Simone de Beauvoir, of the other. Cool, now let's, in the sake of time, move on. So yes, this is, I'll really briefly interrogate the weaponization of sexual violence, consider 3 schools of thought that provide critical explanations of it, attempt to reconceptualize weaponization, and draw on a personal narrative to understand the weaponization of sexual violence from an individual perspective that is commonly lost in the weaponization. So for the sake of time, I'm going to come back to this, the impacts of sexual violence while talking about this case study, but for the moment, will just move on. Now, the reason I'm kind of constructing my approach this way, it's very much grounded in feminist scholarship, which seeks to deconstruct the patriarchal modes of oppression that are often located within mainstream discourses. Feminist theories on wartime rape have followed this tradition through seeking to critically challenge dominant discourses, gender binaries, fixed victim subjectivities, and one-dimensional narratives that are constructed around the universal rather than the diversity of lived victim experiences. Now, I will unpack all of these assumptions that feminist scholarship basically seeks to deconstruct in my later discussion. But yeah, so first and foremost, I'll be drawing on the work of Paul Kirby to conceptualize sexual violence as a weapon of war, as he does a really great job of encapsulating three distinct theories or explanations of sexual violence. The first falls into the category of the kind of irrationality model, where sexual violence is just very opportunistic and kind of just seen as this very irrational behavior. The second category being the instrumentalized model, where sexual violence, and this is quite commonly known and referred to in the weaponization of sexual violence, where the sexual violence is used for a distinct purpose and it's a pursuit of some sort of end. Then I will use the final lens of weaponization and explore that a little bit, because it gives me some good aspects to really develop a reconceptualization of sexual violence. However, it still does fall within the category of a weapon of war, but it's the kind of mythology type approach, where it sees kind of the subjects of sexual violence as like the constructed other. So the first frame on this is kind of just a small graph from his paper to highlight the different frameworks, the middle one being irrationality, the one on the far left being the instrumentalized notion of weaponization, and then the final one being mythology, which I will be drawing a little bit in my analysis, the one that I found the most useful to actually explain the occurrences of sexual violence and generally. Cool. So the first frame of mind, which I'll just race through quite quickly, is the irrationality model, the model of unreason. So in this frame, sexual violence is seen as a weapon of war, but the instrumental benefit of the sexual violence are consequences or afterthoughts, as opposed to planned strategic consequences. So this school of thought is often conceptualized as opportunistic and facilitated by the lack of structure, authority, or norms to regulate the chaotic environment. Now, this type of model, type of explanation, is usually accounts or tries to account for the most horrific accounts of sexual violence, just because it falls under the category of irrationality, and anything abhorrent in the accounts we see today can only be attributed to something of such irrational behavior. Then we've got the more common type of school of thought here, the way of thinking about sexual violence being the instrumentalized, the instrumental school of thought, which characterizes sexual violence as an instrumental strategy, as a weapon of war or a deliberate collective strategy deployed against civilians. It constitutes the well-known kind of means ends reasoning at its purest, Put directly, rape is cheaper than bullets, quoting Kirby there. It is therefore a strategy of political domination designed to control and repress a minority group and acquire, or potentially for the purposes of acquiring land and resources. Now, the international community has very much used this framework of weapon of war, describing sexual violence, as the weaponization of sexual violence. It has been, the imagery was very much emerged in the aftermath of the atrocities witnessed in DRC. Prior to that, the discourse really changed from one of a women's rights issue to one of the weaponization of sexual violence, very much selling the issue and getting greater attention and triggering more condemnation. It was therefore securitized as an issue and kind of plunged into the political framework. And seen as kind of an urgent matter that is an issue of international peace and security. Now, this framework, many scholars have said works very well. It makes the issue one of international peace and security, but also, it is whether or not it helps or hinders the international response to sexual violence is up for debate as well, and scholarship. Now, the final school of thought is the mythology school of thought, through which we can view weaponization as a symbolic framework. It embraces discourses, collective belief systems, and ideologies. Kirby argues that mythology embodies the feminist concern well articulated by Simone de Beauvoir, when she argued that women are essentially othered. And did I put the quote here? No, I didn't. Just to quote de Beauvoir on this notion of the other: once the subject seeks to assert himself, the other, who limits and denies him, is nonetheless a necessity to him. He attains himself only through the reality of which he is not, which is something other than himself. I'll expand on this notion a little bit. I just want to first off really present my arguments against our current conceptualization of weaponization. So the first one is that it renders all experiences of women as in kind of a uniform and universal manner, which actually fails to account for or capture the diversity of victims' experiences. So this language of the rape or sexual violence as a weapon of warfare is kind of just used as a kind of one-dimensional frame, and therefore it presents a systematic representation of sexual violence without actually taking into context the lived realities of women. Second, it isolates women's sexuality on the basis of oppression, which serves to reinforce the sex body as an inevitable target of sexual violence. So in this, no, I don't have that, sorry. So in this frame of thinking, women are just kind of used and seen as inherently rapeable, according to Marcus. So through this frame, we can kind of see women's place in conflict is one which is subject to sexual violence. That is kind of just seen, she is reduced to her biological function, she is reduced to her sex body. And this is where I'd like to really draw on Kirby's conceptualization of the other, as through this frame, I seek to introduce this, this notion of the othering of victims of sexual violence. By the other, I draw again on Simone de Beauvoir's notion of the subject-object relationship constructed in the second sex and developed by Kirby's conceptualization of weaponization. Simone deconstructs the male-female relationship, analyzing the constructions of femininity in a quest to answer the question, what is a woman? To which she famously responds, one is not born, but becomes a woman. The notion of woman is a social construction where women adopt the inferior position as the other against the subject, the man. It is through men's domination that he places her in the context of their subordinated other, the inessential. Cool, and it is here that I present the case for a way in which we can problematize weaponization as it reduces the woman as an essential object. This is seen as women in conflict are inherently othered by representing a symbol of the nation, a territory for defeat. So women women in conflict are often perceived as symbolic representations of the body politique, and therefore kind of seen as the nation in of itself, so kind of symbolized in that sense. Women are reduced to their biological function. So this can be perceived through the weaponization of sexual violence through forced sterilization, and women act as a means for men to target their male enemies, as sexual violence is often a way to communicate to their male counterparts, a kind of male-to-male messaging where women are seen as the way in which to communicate that they have defeated their enemy, and the way in which they seek to humiliate the enemy. So women are very much seen as pawns in that. And the final way in which they are othered is through the framing, through their framing as vulnerable objects. This reduces women to passive, vulnerable objects, defining them as those to whom sexual violence occurs, unable to challenge their subjection. So this places them in a very passive and powerless sort of construction that kind of takes away all their agency and assumes that they are essentially victims, inherent victims of sexual violence. So weaponization reveals the inherent othering of victims of sexual violence and an essential other. The weaponization frame has led the international community to reduce women to essentialist, destructive gendered labels, preventing pragmatic and normative outcomes. For the sake of time, I think I need to move on quite quickly. I think I'll just try and wrap up very quickly by just saying, by presenting some arguments that problematize weaponization on the international stage, where weaponization is very much encapsulated in the Rome Statute of the ICC, and can constitute acts of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. But within all this framing, to which I won't go into too much detail now, the international community essentially presents a hierarchy of victimhood, a very high threshold for prosecution under those frames, and a very low actual rate of prosecution. About 16 of the thousands and thousands of perpetuators have actually been tried or charged for crimes against humanity, genocide, and the works, just kind of showing what a high threshold it is to meet, and how it often means a low prosecution. It also renders the everyday experiences of violence that doesn't meet the criteria of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes as not as important, and it really prioritizes that if the meeting of the threshold exists, then it is very much a something that we can take seriously. And it also creates a hierarchy of sexual violence as well. Cool, and I will, for the sake of time, just rush. To just end with my final slide, which really drawing on a lot of work that has really problematized weaponization for all the accounts, the way in which it's viewed, used by perpetrators and the international community. This almost buzzword kind of can do more harm than good, ignores the victim, the contextualized, the context in which the victim sits, and also the larger systemic gender, systemic gender inequalities that perpetuate that violence as well. So, therefore, scholars kind of draw on this notion of an intersectional approach that one can almost take away from this very strategic way of viewing sexual violence and actually reinsert the victim and reinsert the larger systemic problems at hand that often lead to the sexual violence of women. This is where I really test out my ideas. And it is through this intersectional framework that I would like to introduce a potential new frame through which to analyze sexual violence, drawing on Judith Butler's conceptualization of grievability. I argue that sexual violence should be conceptualized as an act in which we see a life as ungrievable. Ungrievability referring to a life that is already lost, one thus that is never fully alive. This frame also enables us to look at Butler's thesis argument in the context of sexual violence as well. This thesis argument being arguing for the radical equality of everyone, rendering everyone's lives as grievable, as an incalculable value of life. And this is acknowledged acknowledged within the international community. So this normative framework almost takes away from the securitized approach of sexual violence and kind of reinserts a normative framework, the kind of very much the foundations of the women's movement, using this as very much a human rights framework as opposed to a securitized framework. So kind of conceptualizing the way in which sexual violence makes the victims of sexual violence lives ungrievable, and the call to action to ensure that we treat all lives as grievable, therefore protecting them. A great quote that she uses to really conceptualize this notion of grievability. To be grievable is to be interpellated in such a way that your life matters, that the loss of life would matter, that your body is treated as one that should be able to live and thrive, whose precarity is minimized, for which provisions for flourishing should be available. So this should be the guiding principle of social organization, she argues. And therefore, it is with this humanist framework that I argue that we should reconceptualize the notion of weaponization, reinserting the notion of grievability instead. And I'll leave my case study for question time if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Elzanne, for sharing all that with us. So are there any questions? Because I have one.
Yes.
And this is kind of in one of the things that the reasons we created the seminar series is because the three organizers are really interested in the concept of wounds. And I really liked how you were talking about the weapon as removing the person to whom the violence is committed from all these perspectives. And in some ways, I'm wondering whether grievability is actually also about bodies and wounds. The wounds aren't being seen, or they aren't being heard in this case, or they aren't being recognized as human rights. And I'm wondering whether that might be a framework through which you could also see a possibility for your research, so that it's not just that it's a life that's has not the right to be grieved, but its suffering isn't. So it's the suffering endured by the person that isn't allowed to be, or isn't being recognized. And I'm kind of speaking here to the international law norm about unnecessary suffering. Somehow, if we witnessed sexual violence in wartime as part of suffering that ought not to occur in a legal sense, because there's already a definition and expectation in the law that is applied. That might be also a consequence of shifting the frame to the ones to whom the violence is committed, as opposed to the ones who are wielding the weapons. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think in my kind of if I had timed this appropriately, I would have looked a bit more into the way in which the framing in international law, and I didn't dive into it too much either, because I really didn't want to make this a law seminar as well, and to really approach that, you do need to, one, have expertise, and two, really delve into the nitty-gritty of, the Geneva, the Rome Statute, Genocide Convention, and the works. So I kind of just wanted to present those kind of those overarching arguments instead, but one of which was the current definitions and the way in which it is conceptualized through this very this weaponized framework, is argued that it welcomes kind of very systematic forms of sexual violence. So as to constitute as a crime against humanity, to constitute as genocide, it needs to happen as in a widespread, systematic way that very much does leave the individual as as invisible, scholars argue. And this can actually be seen in cases in the international courts where certain like atrocious acts of sexual violence are not deemed to be widespread enough or systematic enough, so therefore kind of seen as null, and in that way kind of really diminishes the the wounds experienced by those individuals who and yeah, it was quite interesting to explore my case study a little bit, that talked, I used a similar methodology as another author who really just made her case study about the women's narratives in the case of Rwanda for this author's account. So I looked specifically at one woman's account in the case of Xinjiang, which was just kind of a thematic analysis through media reporting available to us. But it was interesting kind of with this frame of grievability, not looking at it, was it systematic enough? Is it widespread enough? How many detention camps are there? Can we estimate around 20,000, what constitutes systematic or widespread? Looking very much just at her story of the subject and her account of subjection, and the way in which her life was considered ungrievable, a life already lost, and a life not worth living, and the way in which she was therefore subjected to torture, to brainwashing, and then multiple accounts of rape and gang rape. It really, it created a micro analysis of just this one person's account, and it really kind of made the wounds as the primary focus of analysis, as opposed to the numbers, the quantified numbers on a page. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I think we've got time for one more question. Does anyone have one? Yeah.
You're gonna have to excuse my nervousness here, but when you're changing the framework of something like this, I suppose this doesn't just apply to weaponization and sexual violence, but it could be more broadly applied to war crime or anything like that. But when you're changing the framework around it, how does that relate to what you expect to see coming out of future conflicts?
So that's really interesting. So in the and it was quite challenging and almost a little bit kind of dipping toe in water when you read so many accounts of kind of acknowledging and seeing the weaponization framework as, I mean, not the best, but we still support it because it promotes action and it is compelling. It is a trigger. It's securitized, but you know, at least we get some pragmatic kind of work done. And so that was a bit intimidating. But I think in this kind of larger exploration of what it is, what sexual violence very much is within conflict settings and non-conflict settings, it kind of did call to a framework that can actually capture that without reducing or essentializing women, without rendering individuals invisible, without rendering men and boys invisible. So it was almost through just kind of it was a reluctant sort of shift in conceptualization, just because the current framework wasn't sufficient. And I was quite I was happy to see also that in the kind of the framing of the UN narrative. So it'd be quite interesting to do like a discourse analysis of the UN. I mean, obviously there's so much more work to do, but this kind of progressive nature of conceptualizing kind of sexual violence as through a victim or a survivor-orientated framework, through a human rights framework, kind of does suggest that this sort of approach is slowly being potentially called for. And so, yeah, I'd like to think that I'm just kind of hopping on that train.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so very much. Give a round of applause.